The year was 2018. Hesh and Greg had not seen each other in person for over a decade despite being the closest of friends. Hesh decided that it had been way too long and that a reunion must take place. So he got onto the next plane to the UK, and he surprised Greg. As expected, Greg was ecstatic to see his best mate, but him, James, Joe and Helen had already planned a boat trip for the weekend. "There's space for one more, mate," said Greg. Hesh agreed, and Greg's friends seemed more than happy to have him along. Halfway into the boat trip, the GPS service started to malfunction. The group decided to stay anchored until the GPS service came back on. As the hours passed, the nerves set in. In a panic, Joe decided that it was getting way too dark, and that if they gamble and just sail into any random direction, they'd eventually find land. And so they sailed in one continuous line. Hours passed and darkness fell, and a storm was brewing. The group took cover and held on for dear life as the boat rocked and swayed, banging against the massive waves. This lasted all night. As sunrise began, the storm disappeared almost as if it was scared off by the light of the sun. Everyone got up. Tired, they looked at each other and tried to gather whatever the storm had spared. And then a sudden burst of joy. "Land! Land!" shouted James. They rowed their way as fast as they could to the shore, docked their boat and set up camp. What happened next was a slow destruction of everything modern British society had planted into their young minds. And the saddest part of all was, it hadn't even been a full day on the island. In the midst of an argument between Hesh and Joe, one of many since they had docked the boat earlier in the day, Joe let a quiet insult slip from his lips. "Fucking Packy." James turns to him and says, "Joe, are you a racist?" They both look at each other and smile. James turns to Helen and says, "Helen, I'm a racist too." "Are you a racist?" Helen looks distraught at first, but then cracks a smile. All three of them then turn to Greg, Hesh's best mate, and they say, "Greg, are you a racist too?" Hesh winks at Greg, knowing his full intentions, and Greg says, "Yes, I'm a racist as well." After confessing their racism to each other, the four white best friends decided to imprison Hesh in a cave and strip him of anything that can be used as a weapon. As they stood there well armed, they took shifts making sure that he does not escape. When it came to Greg's shift, as soon as the three other friends disappeared, Greg turned to Hesh and said, "Mate, I didn't mean any of that. I swear I didn't mean it." Hesh looked at him and smiled and said, I know. Greg ran to the edge of the beach and grabbed a boulder, brought it back and said, "Smack me across the head with this, and then run for it, mate. Leg it." He handed Hesh the boulder. Hesh looked at him and said, "I can't do it, mate. I can't harm you." Greg got angry and said, "If you don't fucking do it, they're gonna fucking kill me for letting you escape, man. Just fucking smack me on the head with this." Hesh knew that he was leaving his best friend in a sticky situation, but he just could not bring himself to strike him against the head with that boulder. Hesh threw the boulder on the floor and ran to the hills. Greg looked at him, seething with anger, and said, "You coward! You coward!" After Hesh disappeared, Greg started plotting and scheming. How could he get away with this? Shall he escape as well? He'll never escape Joe and James and Helen. It's 3 against 2. And then it finally hit him. Half an hour before his shift ended, he started self-harm. So that when they do find him, they think that Hesh managed to hurt him and escape. He cut one wrist and then the other, tried to knock himself out with a boulder, but that did not work. As he held the blade in his hand, he decided to make one more cut and then dispose of the blade. But the loss of blood made him pass out. Helen then showed up for her shift and found him there with the blade in his hand. She knew what had happened. As Helen stood there looking at Greg, not knowing what to do, she heard the steps of James and Joe approaching. She panicked, and before she could even think of what to do, she found herself grabbing the blade and hiding it. Was she helping Greg and Hesh? Joe and James showed up and assumed that Hesh had done all this and escaped. Later on that night, Helen was patching up Greg's injuries, and Greg looked at her and said, "Why did you do that?" She didn't answer Greg straight away. Instead, she decided to take her time with the answer. After a while, she said, "Today I confess to you about my racism, but that's not the only thing I want to confess. Greg Curzon, I love you. I want to apologize for what I did earlier. And me and you can escape tonight and go find your best friend. I'm willing to do that, Greg. What do you say?" Greg looked at her excited, with hope in his eyes. He said, "Let's do it." Later on in the night, they both escaped, heading to the place where Greg and Hesh decided to meet up. As Greg and Helen approached Hesh's hiding place, Greg was turned around and was checking out the scene. Hesh peeked and saw that there was Helen with another man. Not knowing about the events that took place, he assumed it was either James or Joe, and so he activated his traps. Unfortunately, Greg stepped into one of the traps. With his back to Hesh, Greg screamed in agony. Hesh came out of his hiding spot, screeching like a madman. Helen falls to her knees. Hesh comes up to Helen and puts the spear to her neck and says, "I'll end ya, just like I ended Joe or James or whoever the fuck that was." And then Greg says, "Hesh!" Hesh pauses and his eyes widen. He turns around, and he sees his best mate, with his wrists all cut up and his head all bruised up from the boulder, and now bleeding from several places in his body, where the trap penetrated the skin and flesh. "My best friend," said Hesh, "caught in my own lethal trap." Hesh was distraught. He then looks up at the sky, and with an angry and regretful look on his face, he screams his heart out. "I'm sorry, Greg. Greg, I'm sorry. I'm gonna kill myself. I'm gonna show you how sorry I am, Greg. I'm gonna do it." "No, just stop it!" screamed Helen. She'd seen enough violence for one day. But Hesh was just a mess. He was mentally gone. He turns around, grabs the spear which he used on Helen earlier, and tries to jam it into his own stomach in front of Greg. Helen jumps in the way and grabs it off him and breaks it in half. At this point, Hesh is seeing red. He turns around, says, "Sorry, Greg," and runs full on into his own traps. Right in front of Greg's eyes, Hesh is being torn from limb to limb. And Hesh and Greg both die at the same time in front of Helen's eyes. Helen spent the remainder of that day digging 2 graves next to each other, with a tunnel in between the 2 graves. She then took both of their hands and linked them up through that tunnel. As she began to cover them with sand, she could see a subtle smile on both of their faces, holding hands in their graves forever. After she finishes the job, she stands up, wipes the last tear from her eye, and puts on a cold face, and walks back to James and Joe, whom she can't even tell what happened. She has to live a lie. And every time James and Joe mock Greg and Hesh's death, she laughs along with him wholeheartedly. But if you were to look into her eye during that laughter, you'd see the sadness clear as light. The end.